Hanne. I'm a visual sociologist, climate activist, and strict sustainable clothing consumer. I have always had a huge passion for the value of people, and it aches my heart when people are suffering. At the moment, as Louder Than the Storm so brilliantly explains, the climate change crisis will unfortunately make people suffer. So that is one of the reasons why I'm a climate activist and strict sustainable clothing consumer. But equally, about a year ago, I wrote my master thesis about the relationship between the clothing consumer and clothing producer. This was a research project that truly became a personal journey for me. So it all started as I was sitting in a coffee shop in southeast London, watching people passing by. I was fascinated by people's clothing, and as I watched the red dress walk by, the knitted jumper being hugged, and the eco-friendly fabric bag being carried across the street, the thought struck me: where did it all come from? Whose hands has stitched these pieces of fabric together? And why don't we care about their origin? That was the beginning of my art installation and research project, Pulling Threads Together. So my art installation, Pulling Threads Together, was divided into 3 parts, in one room open for the public. Let me walk you through it. So part 1. Beforehand, I had interviewed clothing consumers and asked them to bring me one piece of clothing and to share with me a story or a memory attached to that particular garment. I exhibited their clothing with their story attached to it. This illustrating the importance of clothing in our lives, either if we care about fashion or not, and how we are connected to it, and how pieces of clothing serves us. Part 2. Once again, beforehand, after the interviewees had written down their stories, I asked them, who made your garment? And this is where most people wrote, I don't know, or just the name of the store where they got their garment from. I then gave the interviewees a choice. They could either let me, the researcher, hand-stitch their answers into white shirts, or they could do it themselves, meanwhile me paying them the same hourly rate as Cambodian garment worker. This being, at the time, 44p, bearing in mind that the living wage is 47p per hour. At the exhibition, I exhibited the 3 white shirts, collected all their answers, hand-stitched. This illustrating the connection between the producer and the consumer, the tension between something so personal like someone's handwriting meeting the hard labour of stitching, yet revealing that we do not know. Part 3. The final part was an opportunity to respond. I had written a letter on a big piece of fabric to the garment worker that made my favourite jumper, and I gave the audience the same chance to take a piece of fabric, write their own letter and hand stitch it to a larger piece of fabric. It was all voluntarily, but in my research I recognised myself the need to respond, and I wanted to give the same outlet to my audience. So the whole aim with Pulling Threads Together was to create a space of reflection and an opportunity to talk and respond. The audience could move freely between the 3 elements: reading, seeing, and participate in any way they would like. So the whole research project had a massive impact on my personal consumption behaviour. In addition to interviews, I also did desk research and reading journals and watching documentaries and seeing for myself the horrible conditions within the fast fashion industry. But equally, I also got to experience the ignorance of us as clothing consumers. It truly changed me. And Pulling Threads Together as an exhibition had a lot larger impact than what I first anticipated. People contacted me a week later telling me how the exhibition allowed them to reflect on their consumption habits that they've never even thought about before. I also went to a wedding a few months later, meeting a friend of a friend that had heard about my exhibition, and even that had sparked a conversation about sustainable clothing. And I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, so one of the benefits with art is that it can help you see yourself or your culture or your situation differently, simply because you use different senses than what you normally would, or it could be portrayed in a different way than what you normally would see it. And that's what's so cool about art, is that it can take like a topic or an issue, and then it can kind of take it out of its context, which actually can be helpful for us to experience like an inner awakening or realization about what is actually going on. And from there, it's up to us. Do we fall asleep again? Or do we act? And regards to pulling threads together, what I really loved was giving people an experience, inviting them to hand-stitch the truth about them not knowing where their piece of clothing came from, and just give them reflection time in a non-judgmental environment where they can have their own little awakening as they were just pushing through the needle, through the fabric. So at the moment, I'm actually working on a video essay to share my personal journey about becoming a sustainable clothing consumer. You see, there are so many great tips and tricks about how to become a sustainable clothing consumer, but when I went through my journey, I just wish that someone had told me about all the backslides that will happen, that it's a process, that you will be frustrated, but that eventually it will become easy and a part of who you are.